When Viking raiding parties swept down upon the coastal villages of England, Ireland, Francia, or the Slavic lands, it was not only armed men who felt the edge of the sword. What, then, became of their wives? What future awaited the families of the defeated? Within the harsh framework of Viking culture, the fall of a warrior was not the conclusion of violence, but its continuation in another form. His death stripped away the shield that had guarded his household, leaving wives, daughters, and kin exposed to a society that prized dominance, vengeance, and wealth above mercy. The chronicles and sagas of the time, such as the Annals of Ulster or the Chronicon Roscoe-Dents, offer sparse yet chilling glimpses into what followed Norse victories. For the Norse, honor and revenge were interwoven. A warrior slain in battle did not perish alone. His prestige, his lands, and his possessions were forfeited, and his dependents shared in that loss. Widows of fallen fighters were frequently taken as spoils. Konur herteknar, women seized in war. Some were transported across the sea to Viking strongholds like Hedeby or Dublin, where their fates split into very different paths. To Viking eyes, such treatment was not cruelty but a form of order, justice imposed by power. The defeated had no inheritance to leave behind, only survivors to be bent beneath the will of the victors. In the stark logic of that age, the family of a fallen man was counted as part of the spoils of conquest. What happens when conquest wears the mask of kinship? In Viking society, some women from defeated groups were not consigned to slavery. They were married. But these marriages were never gestures of reconciliation. They were calculated acts of power, subjugation formalized through ritual. After raids or territorial takeovers, prominent Viking leaders, jarls, or even kings would sometimes forcibly marry the widows or daughters of their rivals. This was not an act of romance, nor even a pursuit of lust. It was cold strategy. By claiming a noble woman of a defeated clan as his wife, a Norse leader could assert dominion over her bloodline, her people, and her inheritance. The Laxdæla saga records the tale of Ketil Flatnose, who led his household from Norway to the British Isles. There, intermarriage, often through coercion, served as a frequent method of strengthening power. The sagas, written generations later, sometimes dress these stories in the clothing of romance, but the truth beneath was far harsher. The woman had no agency. Her consent was irrelevant. She became a token in a game of power. This practice was especially common in regions where the Norse intended to settle permanently, such as Ireland, northern England, and Normandy. Having defeated local rulers, Viking chieftains would establish themselves as lords, legitimizing their new rule by marrying into the households they had conquered. To them, a widow was not a grieving partner, but a gateway to her husband's former holdings. Such marriages also worked as a tool of assimilation. By binding themselves to local elites, Norse rulers could ease resistance, strengthen alliances, and root themselves more securely in conquered territories. Children born of these unions inherited mixed identities, Norse in blood, local in land and memory. Yet, for the women themselves, these marriages were not reconciliations. They stood as living testaments to defeat, symbols that the conqueror not only possessed the land, but now claimed the very lineage of the vanquished. To Viking leaders, such women were not simply war prizes. They were instruments of empire. To fall captive to the Norse was to lose one's claim to freedom. For many women seized in war, the path ahead was neither marriage nor death, but slavery. In Old Norse, the term was threll, pronounced thrael, a thrall, the lowest rung in Viking society, a person stripped of kin, of honor, and of rights. Viking raids were not simply wars of expansion. They were also economic ventures. Women and children captured in raids on Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, Slavic, and even rival Scandinavian communities were often taken alive specifically to be traded. The Annals of Ulster and the writings of Nennius record raids in which great numbers of women and youths were carried off, bound for Norse ships and a life of bondage. These captives were shipped to flourishing markets in Hedeby in Denmark, Kaupang in Norway, and especially Dublin in Ireland. By the 10th century, Dublin had grown infamous as a Viking slave hub, where Christian captives were sold not only to Norse households, but also to Muslim traders from Al-Andalus and the Abbasid Caliphate. The Norse recognized that enslaved women, especially young and able-bodied, were among the most lucrative forms of portable wealth. For a thrall woman, life was unrelenting. On rural farms, she worked ceaselessly, hauling water, tending animals, grinding grain. In the homes of wealthier Norse families, she might serve as a nurse, maid, or wet nurse, but never with autonomy. Her body, too, was at the disposal of her master. Children born of such unions were often denied inheritance and, unless formally recognized, were condemned to servitude as well. In Grettir's saga, a thrall woman is described as chattel, without voice or will. Yet many endured long enough to bear children and even grandchildren. Over time, some gained partial freedom or purchased liberty, but such cases were rare, often coming only after decades of backbreaking labor. Slavery in the Viking world was not based on race but conquest. A noblewoman from Northumbria, taken in war, could find herself working beside a Slavic villager or an Irish nun, both stripped of identity, both reduced to tools within a world ruled by violence. For the defeated warriors, the fight ended on the battlefield. But for their wives and daughters, a second, quieter war began. Hints linger in the sagas and chronicles suggesting that not every captured woman was taken into slavery or marriage. Some may have endured something more terrifying still: public humiliation, carried out not in secret but in full view of the community. Although no formal Viking law codifies such practices, fragments of lore and medieval accounts suggest that symbolic rituals of shaming may have existed, designed not only to harm, but to demonstrate conquest. In the Norse world, honor was the foundation of status. To disgrace an enemy's wife or daughter in front of witnesses was to erase his legacy, to corrupt his bloodline, and to declare his defeat complete. Some scholars suggest that humiliation rituals may have included stripping women of their garments, cutting their hair, or forcing them into mock roles that ridiculed their former nobility. Such acts, if practiced, would not simply have degraded individuals but sent a stark message: this woman, and everything she represents, has been broken. The silence of the records may veil the harshest truths. What the survivors endured may never have been written, and what was written may have been softened for later audiences. For women who faced such treatment, their stories are shadows, possible, probable, but concealed within silence. The Viking conquest of families was not simply the aftermath of war, it was war continued by other means. Through forced marriage, through slavery, and perhaps through humiliation, the Norse imposed power not only over bodies but over memory, lineage, and identity. These acts were not simply expressions of dominance, they were acts of erasure. So, what do you think was the most enduring cultural legacy of Viking integration through conquest? Marriage as strategy, slavery as commerce, or terror as memory? Share your reflections below. History does not forget. It waits in the silence between what was endured and what was recorded.